the wagon, and the scream. The Montana Territory in late July had a way of looking endless miles of open prairie stretching out under a white-hot sky, the horizon trembling in the heat. The air carried the dry tang of dust and sun-baked grass, the kind of air that clung to the skin and dried the throat. Along a rutted dirt road, a lone wagon jolted hard over a rut, its wooden frame letting out a groan as if even it was tired of the journey. Inside the cramped space was dark and stifling smelling of sweat, old grain sacks, and the faint, acrid tang of metal from the iron bolts holding the thing together. The woman inside had been kicking for what felt like hours. She drove the heel of her boot into the slats again, the wood splintering in protest. Her breath came in harsh bursts, the heat stealing her air, but she screamed anyway, hoarse, raw, desperate. The sound was high and cutting sharp enough to scatter a flock of crows from the cottonwoods lining the road. Black wings beat against the pale sky, and their harsh cries echoed hers before fading into the distance. The driver jerked at the noise. He was a thin man with greasy hair plastered to his temples, his split lip an old wound that looked like it had never healed right. He muttered a curse, words thick with irritation, and slapped the reins across the horses' backs. "Quiet down, girl." His voice was a rasping growl, but she only kicked harder, knocking a small crate over so it rolled and banged against the wall. A mile or so ahead at the crest of a hill where the road narrowed between grass-covered rises, Juan Locke reined in his bay gelding. The horse's ears twitched toward the distant racket. Juan's eyes narrowed against the glare. At 32, with skin weathered from years under the sun, and a thin, pale scar running from the hinge of his jaw to his chin, he had the look of someone who had seen enough trouble to recognize it from a distance. And what he saw in the unsteady sway of that wagon, how it pitched and jolted as if someone inside was fighting, the very boards made his gut tighten. The wind shifted just enough to carry the sound to him. A scream, faint but unmistakable, cut through the hum of cicadas and the whisper of grass. It wasn't the sound of an argument, nor the yelp of surprise. It was something else. Fear sharpened with defiance. His hand slid to the butt of his rifle without conscious thought. On the plains, a man learned to tell the difference between a situation that could be ignored and one that would follow you if you turned away. This one, he knew, would follow him. He nudged his gelding forward the horse's hooves, striking the packed earth in a steady rhythm, and began closing the distance. Intervention. Juan kept his approach steady, riding close enough to see into the shadows between the wagon's slats. The woman inside had her back braced against one wall, her boot planted against a splintered board she'd already cracked through. The sharp edge had bitten into her hand. Fresh blood streaked her knuckles, shining dark red against the dust on her skin. Sweat had plastered strands of dark hair to her temples, and her eyes' sharp, defiant snap to him the moment she caught sight of the horseman. The driver saw him too. His shoulders hunched as if to make himself smaller, but his voice came out lazy as though this was all nothing worth fussing over. "Bride trade out of Billings," he called over the clatter of wheels. "Daddy owed some money. I'm just the middleman getting her where she needs to go." Juan reined in alongside, keeping his tone level. "That right?" The woman's head jerked toward him. "He's lying," she said, her voice low but carrying. "I was taken." Her voice wasn't pleading. It had grit in it, like she was staking her ground even here, even in the cage of that wagon. That alone told Juan enough. The driver shifted his eyes, cutting toward the shotgun propped beside him. His fingers twitched, inching toward it. Juan didn't give him the chance. The rifle came up to his shoulder, smooth as a habit, and he squeezed off around into the dirt just ahead of the wagon's team. The blast cracked across the prairie, echoing off the low hills. The horses reared, snorting and rolling their eyes, one of them lathered white with sweat. The driver froze his hand, hovering inches from the gun. "Step down," Juan said, calm as a winter pond. "Now." For a moment, the man looked like he might argue, but something in Juan's voice, or maybe in the steady weight of that rifle, aimed his way, decided it for him. He climbed down, boots hitting the dirt with a dull thud, and backed away from the wagon with both hands raised. Juan swung his rifle toward the ground, but didn't lower it entirely. "Keep walking," he said. The man muttered something low and sour, but he obeyed, trudging away along the road until distance and heat shimmer swallowed him. Then Juan swung down from his horse and crossed to the wagon door. Release and offer. The door's latch was rusted and stiff, but Juan worked it open. The woman didn't wait for him to offer a hand. She stepped down herself, landing with a jolt that sent dust puffing up around her boots. She straightened, meeting his gaze without flinching. Up close, Juan could see the tremor in her hands, the way her shoulders held tension like a drawn bowstring, but her chin stayed high. The sound of the driver's footsteps was already fading the empty road stretching ahead and behind. Juan crossed to the wagon team and unbuckled the traces, giving each horse a swat to send them trotting off into the wide open. "You're not anyone's property," he said, the words plain and unadorned. Her breath hitched almost imperceptibly, but her voice was steady when she said, "Vada Dorsey." It sounded like she was reclaiming something her own name out here in the open air. "Juan Locke," he replied. "I've got a place not far from here. By the mussel shell." He hesitated a beat, not wanting the words to sound like they carried a condition. "You can rest there. No strings. No debt." Her brow-lifted eyes narrowing slightly in assessment. "I don't need saving." "Then don't think of it as saving," he said, shrugging one shoulder. "Think of it as getting from one safe place to another." For a long second she didn't move. Then she stepped closer. He swung back into the saddle and extended a hand. She took it firm, grip, no tremor, and swung up behind him. The ride west was quiet. The heat shimmered off the grass, and the leather creaked under their combined weight. At first her posture stayed rigid, her hands resting lightly against his belt as though she was prepared to spring off at any moment. But as the miles stretched on and nothing happened, no questions, no pressure, her grip loosened. By the time the cottonwoods marking the edge of the mussel shell came into view, Juan could feel her breathing had steadied. He kept his eyes on the trail, giving her the space to settle in her own time. Out here, trust wasn't something you asked for. It was something you earned, one quiet mile at a time. First night at the homestead. By the time Juan's bay gelding reached the narrow track leading up to his homestead, the sun had dropped low enough to wash the plains in molten gold. Shadows stretched long over the grass, and the faint scent of river water carried on the breeze from the mussel shell. The cabin stood ahead, plain squared timbers, weathered by years of wind, a stone chimney curling thin smoke into the cooling air. Juan swung down first, boots hitting the packed dirt with a muted thud, then offered a hand to Vada. She slid down without using it, landing lightly but stiff from the ride. Her gaze swept over the place corral to one side, barn to the other, a lean-to stacked with split wood. It was small, solitary. but everything about it spoke of a man who kept things in working order. He pushed the cabin door open with a shoulder. The hinges gave a low groan, and the smell of pine resin wood smoke and something faintly herbal greeted them. Inside the space was modest a wood stove near the center, a scarred table with two mismatched chairs, shelves lined with jars of preserved beans and honey. A narrow bed sat beneath the only window, the quilt on it patched but clean. "You can have the bed," Juan said, setting his hat on a peg by the door. "I'll take the loft over the barn tonight." She frowned. "Why?" His eyes flicked to hers, steady and unreadable. "Because you've had enough of men crowding you. You need a night where you don't have to look over your shoulder." The words startled her more than she wanted to admit. She glanced toward the bed again, then back at him. "There's stew from earlier, if you want it," he went on. "Eat rest, and in the morning you can decide where you're headed." After he left, the quiet settled deep. She crossed to the wash basin, poured cool water into the bowl, and scrubbed the dust from her face and hands. The bed felt strange beneath her, at first too still, too safe, but exhaustion seeped into her bones. For the first time in weeks, she let her eyes close without rehearsing an escape in her head. Work and quiet, connection. The morning came with pale light spilling across the floorboards. Vada rose early, drawn outside by the cluck and shuffle of hens in the coop. Juan was already there, scattering grain from a dented bucket. Without a word, she took it from him and finished the chore. He only nodded, moving off toward the barn with an armful of tools. Through the day, she moved easily into the rhythm of work, gathering eggs, still warm from the nests, skimming cream from a pail of fresh goat's milk, hanging laundry on the line where it flapped in the rising breeze. Juan worked the fence line, replacing a warped rail and checking the wire for sag. They crossed paths often, their words few but not unfriendly. By midday they sat on the porch with tin mugs of coffee, watching the wind ripple the grass toward the river. "I used to dream about a place like this," she said finally. He glanced at her over the rim of his cup. "You can stay as long as you want. Call it your choice, not charity." Something on the way he said it, without a trace of demand, settled in her chest. She didn't answer right away, only sipped her coffee, letting the silence between them feel like something earned rather than imposed. Small moments of care. The rain came without warning. 3 nights later, hard, windless sheets drumming against the cabin roof. Juan was in the barn when the leak started, water dripping down into the hayloft. By the time Vada realized he hadn't come in, he was already up on a ladder in the downpour, hammering a patch of tin into place. "You're going to drown out here," she shouted over the noise. Roofs giving way, he called back, rain streaming from his hat brim. When the last nail was set, she caught his arm and hauled him toward the cabin. Inside, she shoved a dry shirt into his hands and fetched a towel. "Here before you freeze." He stood dripping on the wood floor, and she stepped close, rubbing the towel over his head until his hair stuck up in damp waves. The simple, practical act slowed their eyes, meeting for a beat too long. His hand rose to still hers, and he murmured, "Thank you." It was only 2 words, but they held more than gratitude. The space between them felt changed, warmer, charged. When he leaned in, the kiss was tentative testing, but when they pulled apart, something unspoken had been agreed upon. Seasons shifting. By late August, the light had softened. Mornings started with a hint of chill that clung until the sun climbed high. and the air smelled faintly of dry grass and river water. The mussel shell ran slower, now its edges rimmed with tall reeds where the bees drifted heavy with pollen toward the hives. Juan kept along the fence line. Vada had learned the rhythm of this place almost without realizing it. She helped with the hives moving slowly under the gauze of the bee veil, the hum vibrating through her bones. She held the frames steady as Juan brushed the bees away, careful not to crush them, and together they carried combs into the kitchen. The scent of warm wax and fresh honey filled the air, clinging to her hands even after she washed them. The work gave them chances to talk, not long conversations, but enough to reveal pieces of who they were. Vada told him about her brother drowned in a swollen creek when she was 12, and the mill where she'd worked for a year, the air so thick with dust she'd cough until her ribs ached. She spoke of the boarding house on the edge of Billings where freight trains passed at night and shook the walls. Juan, in turn, told her about the winter his mother died, the kind of cold that turned breath into needles, and about the woman he'd once planned to marry, until she'd chosen a man with a bigger spread and steadier income. He spoke without bitterness, just as someone who had learned not to stake everything on one plan. The silences between them changed. They no longer carried wariness. They carried the ease of two people who didn't have to fill every moment with words. Time was measured not by days since she'd been taken from the wagon, but by tasks completed, honey-jarred wood, stacked fences mended. And in that quiet trust took root, not sudden, not dramatic, but strong as a cottonwood along the river bank. Decision to stay. The first frost came early, turning the grass to white lace under the dawn light. Vada stepped outside in Juan's old wool coat, pulling it tight as her breath curled in the air. From the yard, she saw him hauling the last of the squash into the root cellar, his movement steady, deliberate. He looked up when he saw her, and for a moment she simply stood there smiling without meaning to. That afternoon, as steam curled from their coffee mugs, she said it plain. "I'll stay through the winter." Juan didn't react with surprise or relief, only a nod as though he'd already counted on it. "We'll need more feed for the goats," he said, "and we should check the chimney before the next snow." The next days were full of preparation. They salted pork in barrels, hung strings of onions from the rafters, stacked cord after cord of wood under the lean-to. She helped him haul bales of hay, her boots crunching on the frosted ground, her hands raw from the rope. Evenings found them inside the air, warm with the scent of drying herbs and wood smoke. Sometimes she read aloud from the few books he owned. Other times they worked in silence, the lamplight softening the edges of the day. The quiet between them now was not the guarded kind. It was the kind that meant two people had settled into the same rhythm like two horses, pulling the same cart steady and sure. Integration into the home. By October, Vada's presence had become part of the cabin's fabric. She suggested rebuilding the chicken coop after a fox got in one night and carried off 2 hens. Juan didn't argue. He handed her the measuring stick and let her mark the boards. Together, they hammered, sawed, and strung new wire until the coop stood solid against any intruder. Her belongings, few as they were, had slipped into place without ceremony. Her coat hung beside his on the peg, her brush sat next to his razor on the shelf above the wash basin. On a wind-rattling afternoon he brought down a small box from the top shelf of the wardrobe. Inside lay a silver ring, worn smooth with years. "It was my mother's," he said. "She'd have liked you." The words caught her off guard more than the gift itself. She turned the ring in her fingers, the metal warm from his hand, and then slid it onto her finger. It fit well enough, but that wasn't the point. It wasn't a proposal, it was a mark of belonging. That night, lying beside him with the wind pressing against the cabin walls, she realized she no longer thought of the plains as something she might cross to get somewhere else. The wind didn't sound like the wagon's rattling boards anymore. It sounded like home. Elias arrives. The cottonwoods along the river had turned gold, their leaves flickering in the breeze like coins catching light. Vada was in the yard, hanging laundry, when she saw the rider appear over the ridge, a lone figure slouched in the saddle, his horse plodding with the gait of an animal that had been on the trail too long. Juan was splitting logs near the woodpile. He straightened axe resting on his shoulder and watched the man approach. The rider was in his mid-40s, his coat patched at the elbows, the brim of his hat pulled low. Dust clung to him in a way that spoke of days without shelter. His horse was ribby, its tack worn thin. He swung down stiffly at the gate, keeping one hand on the saddle horn as if testing the ground. "Name's Elias Dunn," he said, voice rough from disuse. "Looking for work. Don't need much pay. Just food and a dry place to sleep." Juan studied him for a beat, then asked, "Can you mend fence?" "Keep a barn clean. I can mend fence. Fix harness sure horse," Elias said simply. "And I can sleep on the floor if that's what's offered." Vada stepped down from the porch, drying her hands on her apron. "Come inside for coffee," she said. At the table, Elias cradled the mug between both hands, sipping slow. She noticed the way his eyes flicked toward the silver ring on her finger, then dropped again. When Juan left to fetch a spare blanket from the loft, Elias spoke quietly. "Had a daughter once. Fever took her 2 winters back. She'd have been 15 this year." His voice didn't crack, but the grief sat heavy in the space between words. Vada didn't offer platitudes, just met his gaze and gave a small, steady nod. It was enough. Shared understanding. Elias worked like a man who owed the land a debt. He patched the barn roof before the first snow cleared fallen limbs from the fence line and carved a rack for drying fish down by the river. He didn't linger over tasks or waste breath on chatter. He simply did what needed doing. Evenings they'd sit by the fire, Juan, Vada, and Elias, while the wind rattled against the shutters. Elias told short stories, each one clipped and simple: a mule that refused to cross a river, a blizzard in Dakota that trapped him in a sod house for 5 days, a calf born in the middle of a thunderstorm. There was a wry humor in some of them, but others were edged with the quiet resignation of a man who'd lived through more than he cared to recount. One night after Elias had turned into the bunk in the barn, Vada and Juan stayed on the porch watching frost form silver in the moonlight. "He's carrying it with him," she said, her voice low. Juan nodded. "A lot of folks are. Difference is what you do with it." They didn't speak after that, but the understanding settled between them like another layer of warmth against the cold. Elias stayed until the tail end of winter, leaving one morning with his horse looking stronger than when he'd arrived. His parting handshake was firm, his thanks brief, but his absence left a stillness in the yard. He'd given them more than his labor. He'd left behind the quiet lesson of survival without bitterness. Commitment and marriage. Late winter pressed close against the cabin. The snow outside piled in drifts, that sparkled under the pale sun. Days were short, but the hours inside were long, and full splitting kindling, baking bread, mending clothes. Vada had grown used to the sound of Juan moving about the space, the steady rhythm of his steps, the low hum of him thinking while he worked. One afternoon, while cleaning out the loft, she sat cross-legged among old saddlebags and boxes, laughing over a moth-eaten quilt she'd found. Juan looked over from where he was stacking grain sacks. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked. She brushed hair back from her face. "I think we should just get married," she said, her tone even as if she'd been asking about the weather. For a moment he only looked at her. Then the corner of his mouth lifted into a small, sure smile. "All right." 2 days later, they stood in the yard behind the cabin, boots crunching on hard-packed snow. No preacher, no guests, just their own voices, speaking quiet vows under a pale sky. Juan slipped the silver ring back onto her finger, but this time with both hands, holding her gaze. When they kissed, it wasn't hurried or tentative. It was steady, like everything else they had built together, meant to last through every season ahead. Winter deepens. February pressed down like a heavy palm. The sky a pale sheet that threatened snow, even when none fell. When it did, it came quietly, a steady sift that softened every line of the plains, until the cabin seemed a dark knot in a blank quilt. Days were trimmed short, the thin light arriving late and leaving early, and inside the cabin the world narrowed to lamplight breath, in the small economies of staying warm. They rose before dawn, dressing in silence, while the stove shook itself awake with a low, iron cough. One would pull on his boots and lift the latch to the cold steam rising from the animals' backs as he moved among them to check hooves and hay. Vada brewed chicory and stirred the morning porridge with a wooden spoon smoothed by years of hands listening for his heavy steps returning through the snow. They spoke in short threads about the goat's milk, the barrel of salted pork. The last 2 jars of blackberries, each line of talk tied directly to the day's work. And yet beneath those plain exchanges ran a deeper conversation that needed no words. "I'm here. You're here. We're making it through." One evening, after a long spell of wind that rattled the shutters like a fist, Juan spread a folded paper on the table. His handwriting, blocky, deliberate, had the careful dignity of a man who came to letters late but respected them. "Been talking to Rourke at the county office," he said, tapping the page with an ink-dark finger. "There's a way to amend the deed." Vada paused with the ladle hovering over the stew. "Amend it, I'll put your name alongside mine." He didn't make a speech of it, and his face didn't ask for praise. He said it like he was setting a fence post where it always should have been. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. All the fight she'd needed to survive, the instinct to guard, to calculate angles, to keep an exit in mind, loosened in a single breath. "You don't have to," she said, knowing, even as she said it, that the words were only a ritual before the truth. "I know I don't." He met her eyes. "I want to." She set the ladle down and came to his shoulder, the lamplight turning the paper a warm gold. "Then write it," she said. "Write me unto it." So he did slowly, carefully, his hand steady as he set her name beside his. Vada watched the letters form proof that the cabin, the corral, the rows of sleeping garden under snow were not a place she borrowed, but a place that was hers. Later, tucked into bed with the wind sighing at the eaves, she lay awake and traced the seam where 2 quilts met, thinking of everything that had brought her to this wooden room. The wagon's dark box, the crack of a rifle, the long ride under a punishing sun, a porch coffee shared without pressure. None of it vanished with the ink on the deed, but it changed shape. It became something she'd walked through to reach a door she could shut and call her own. Outside, the night went on whispering across the drifts. Inside, the stove ticked as the last split log settled. Juan's breath evened beside her, and Vada closed her eyes on the simple, immense fact of belonging. Roots and neighbors. By the last week of December, the snow had crusted hard enough to bear their weight. The world sparkled in the brittle sunlight, every fence post capped like a candle, every willow glittering with hoarfrost. Word came from down valley the Waywrights were hosting Christmas Eve supper for whoever could make the walk. It wasn't a promise of plenty, nobody had plenty in a winter like this, but it was a promise of warmth shared across distances the wind loved to widen. They wrapped themselves in wool and stepped out, boots squeaking on the cold. Their path cut a clean line through the whiteness, two sets of prints running side by side, the sky above, glazed crystal blue. Half a mile on the land dipped, and the wind rose, needling their cheeks red. Juan reached for Vada's hand without comment, tucking her knuckles against his coat where his warmth could hold them. She squeezed once an answer. The Waywright cabin was already a glow box on the horizon, smoke standing straight like a dark ribbon against the pale. Inside, the air hit them with a wall of heat and the scent of venison onions and cedar. Boots thudded on the plank floor as neighbors turned and called greetings, Mrs. Nolan with her broad laugh quiet. Tom Haskin, who always carved more than he ate the Jensen boys, with their hair sticking up like startled crows. The table groaned under honest food venison haunch, with pan gravy potatoes mashed and flecked with black pepper winter apples, stewed down with cinnamon, and a small loaf sweetened with the summer honey. Juan had traded for coffee. Stories were served with the food this storm, and the last the bear print found near the river, the heifer that refused to calve until someone sang to her. No one could agree on the song. Laughter lifted and fell like the flames. When the plates were scraped clean and the mugs refilled with something mulled and sharp, old Mr. Waywright rapped his cup for quiet. To first winters and 15th winters, he said, eyes sweeping the room. To the roots we put down so the wind must fight harder to move us. He turned to Vada with a wink kind as weathered leather. Let him root deep and he'll hold. You too. There was a hush around the soft laughter that followed. The words weren't advice so much as weather lore tested practical true. They walked home under a spill of stars so clear it hurt to look long. Snow squeaked, breath puffed white. Somewhere a fox barked twice the sound, small and bright in the vast dark. In spring, Vada said, "We'll add 6 hens, 2 Rhode Islands if Harold still has them. Maybe a milk doe. We've room for 1 more, and the fence is solid now. And maybe a crib." Juan said, not turning, not forcing the words, just laying them down in the snow between them to see how they looked. Vada's smile warmed the scarf against her mouth. It was a thought that might have frightened her a year ago, when everything she owned could fit into a carpet bag, and safety meant running. Now it unfurled like steam off a kettle, ordinary, welcome real. Maybe a crib, she said. On the porch, they paused to let the night finish its sentence. The cottonwoods whispered. The river hissed softly under ice. Inside, the house greeted them with its stored heat and the faint perfume of cedar boughs Vada had tucked over the mantel. She set their gloves near the stove and watched them steam dry, thinking not of scarcity, but of planning of the quiet abundance that came from knowing exactly what you had and who you had it with. "Roots, then," she said. "Roots," he answered, and kissed her forehead like a pledge. Years later, years do their work slowly, like water finding the easy path. The cabin's logs darkened to a fine, respectful gray. The porch steps sagged at the edges where 100 small feet leapt from them. The cottonwoods thickened their crowns until summer winds played them like instruments. Time was kept not by calendars pinned to walls, but by recurring certainties: the first swimmable day in June, the dust harvest of August, the geese writing their crooked letters south each October, the hush that fell before a blue-cold snow. The garden stretched into confident rows, beans climbing their poles, potatoes sleeping under mounded dirt, corn tasseling high enough to rattle like paper when the children ran past. There were 3 of them now, James with Juan's steady hands, Cora with Vada's narrow, considering eyes, and little Eli, who laughed with his whole ribs and insisted bees liked him best. The dog Patch slept in whatever patch of sun claimed the yard, opening one eye only when a wayward hen decided his tail was a roost. Work filled their days, but it was the kind that layered meaning until the smallest task rang with it. Juan lifted frames thick with honey while James watched, learning the hold that kept the bees calm. Vada taught Cora the trick of testing bread with a knuckle, and the gentleness needed to set a chick back under its broody mother. Evenings, when the light thinned to copper, and the river turned all its surfaces to mirrors, they ate on the porch bowls, in hands, boots propped, children leaning against their legs, while stories found their level like cooling syrup. There were lean seasons. A hard hail in one August took the corn flat. A fever ran through the valley one winter and left too many chairs empty at church. They buried a kid goat under the willow, then a favorite hen, then someday an old dog whose collar Vada kept hanging on a peg for months before she could bear to put it away. The hurt never failed to sting, but it came threaded with what remained the hive that wintered well. The calf born fast and breathing strong, the hand still there at the other end of the bench. Late one summer, after haying left them all straw-haired and ache-muscled, Juan and Vada sat on the porch, while the children's voices rose from the river bright as fish breaking water. The sky was the color of peaches near the horizon, deepening to a velvet blue overhead. Crickets scratched. Somewhere a nighthawk sliced the air with its strange hollow call. Juan's hand found Vada's on the armrest and stayed there, the familiar weight of it, an entire language. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly, eyes on the river path, where the children would return trailing water and summer behind them. She turned her head and read the years in his profile, the pale seam of the jaw scar gone soft with time, the creases fanning from his eyes, the steadiness that had never once failed her. She thought of the wagons boxed dark and the open miles that followed, of a door opened without demand, of a deed signed in lamplight, of a winter hand tucked into a coat pocket on a long walk toward neighbors, of bees humming like a low prayer, of small heads bowed over school slates at the table her elbows had polished smooth. Regret. The word felt like a stranger come looking for a room in a full house. "No," she said, and the answer wasn't dramatic. It was simple, bone-deep true. Every day's been worth it. They sat until the western rim went dark and the first stars pricked through. James whooped from the river bend. Cora's laugh followed. Eli argued cheerfully with a frog. The night gathered them in without hurry. One squeezed her fingers once, and Vada returned it, their hands mapped together by habit and harvest, and the quiet courage of choosing the same place, the same person, again and again. The cottonwoods gave their long, soft shiver, and the wind that once had sounded like leaving now sounded like home.